The bookshop hadn't opened in 80 years, yet tonight its door creaked. They say stories live forever, but some stories trap you inside them. Agatha Christie's Miss Marple and the Bookshop of Shadows. A detective case full story. Open the book if you dare to be. Chapter 1. The candle burns at both ends. In the rain-soaked heart of a forgotten corner of England, beneath a sky too dark for dusk and too early for midnight, the cobblestones of Darnley Green glistened like polished bone beneath the flickering gaslight, each puddle reflecting the jagged outline of leafless trees bent by time and storm. The wind wound through the crooked lanes like a whisper half-remembered, and every shuttered window along Hemlock Row stood closed, not just by habit, but by something older than war, or grief, or memory. It was on this particular evening, as the village clock tower yawned its chimes into the void 1 minute too soon, that the candle in the window of a long-abandoned shop flickered to life. The shop had a name, though no one uttered it anymore, save perhaps the oldest among them in moments of half-sleep and shivering recollection. Belladonna Books was painted in faded gilt above the door, a door which had remained locked, rusting, untouched since 1945, or so it had been believed. The glass was cracked through its centre like a hairline fracture in a skull, yet behind it the candle glowed stubbornly, as if held by invisible hands. In that moment, had anyone dared walk past the shop on their way home from the pub or the chapel or the lonely bus stop beyond the hill, they might have noticed the window pane breathing faintly with fog from the inside. But no one did. No one had in years. At a modest cottage nestled behind a tangled rose hedge some 2 miles from the centre of the village, Miss Jane Marple sat with her embroidery and a fresh pot of tea, her eyes trained more on the firelight's movements across the floorboards than the delicate threads she'd been stitching for hours. She had, over time, developed an intuitive sense of when the air changed, when something, somewhere, began writing a new story in invisible ink, and it was just as she paused, needle in hand, that the knock came, soft at first, then firm, then gone. She opened the door not to a visitor, but to a sealed envelope, cream paper browned slightly with age, the wax seal cracked by time rather than tampering. She bent to pick it up, and her hands did not tremble, though her breath held itself like a page not yet turned. Inside the envelope, a single sentence, handwritten in charcoal ink. She never left. She never could. The script was unfamiliar, yet oddly self-aware. Miss Marple stared at it for a long time, longer than necessary, and then, as the rain deepened and the winds carried a single far-off scream across the moors, the village clock struck once, and again, and again, and did not stop at 12. Instead, it sang a 13th chime, low, uncertain. The scream was neither long nor loud, but it was the sort that came from someone who had seen something they had no words for, only sound, and then it too vanished into the silence, leaving no trace, save for the ripples it sent through the heart of a woman who had solved countless crimes, but never truly feared the night. Until now. Miss Marple, ever the rationalist, ever the patient stitcher of social fabric and forensic pattern alike, rose from her chair. She poured a second cup of tea, though she was alone. She opened her notebook and began a new page. She wrote, Darnley Green, 13 chimes. Candle at Belladonna, letter with no sender, the past is reaching forward. Then, without fanfare, she rose, donned her rain-cloak, and stepped into the night, leaving the fire to die quietly behind her. The path to Darnley Green was not long, but tonight it seemed lengthened by some strange spatial trick. Trees leaned differently, distances stretched and shrank, as if the village had shifted in its sleep. The signpost at the edge of town no longer bore its name. In its place, a black smear, tar-like, as if someone or something had tried to erase it entirely. Belladonna Books stood at the village's edge, next to the old apothecary and the collapsed well, where no children dared toss coins. Miss Marple had seen it only once before, years ago, after a minor theft at the baker's had led her through its door quite by accident. But it had been closed then, empty and unwelcoming, and what she remembered most was the smell, not of dust, but lavender, and something fainter beneath. Now as she approached, the candlelight beckoned, not warm, not inviting, but present. The kind of presence that makes one question if they are the observer or the observed. The door, for all its rusted handle and peeling paint, swung open easily beneath her touch. Inside, the air did not feel stale. Quite the opposite. It was scented with ink and old leather, the perfume of books that had not been read, but remembered. The shelves stood perfectly straight despite the shop's leaning walls, and each volume was in its place, as if awaiting only the right reader. A single book lay open on the counter. She stepped closer. The page was dated with tomorrow's date. Her name, Jane Marple, was etched in the upper corner, not in her hand, but in the same charcoal script from the letter. Below it, one sentence repeated itself again and again down the page, varying only in its final word. She opened the book and the story changed. She opened the book and the story forgot. She opened the book and the story remembered. She opened the book and the story ended. She did not turn the page, not yet. Instead, she moved to the back of the shop, where a door once leading to a storage room now stood as a wall of polished mirror. Unusual but not unheard of. In it, she saw herself, composed, rain-dappled, curious. But then, only then, she noticed the candle in her reflection flickered at the wrong rhythm. Behind her in the mirror, it sputtered when hers burned steadily. She turned. There was no one behind her. And yet the candle in the mirror remained different, its wax forming a shape that could only be seen when not looked at directly. Something like a letter. Something like a symbol, something not meant to be remembered but not meant to be ignored either. Suddenly, the record player at the far corner of the shop began to spin. No one had touched it. The needle dropped on its own. A melody played. A waltz, slow and sorrowful. Then, a voice. Crackling, female and unmistakably calm. "Finish what you started, Jane, or we'll write someone else." Miss Marple did not flinch. But something inside her, something old and certain, shifted, like a locked drawer finding its key. She stepped backward, reaching for the notebook in her pocket. When she opened it, the page she had just written had changed. The words were hers, but different. Darnley Green, 13 chimes. Candle at Belladonna. The letter arrived too late. The past is no longer past. She looked up. The door had closed, and the candle burned lower. She would stay until it burned out. She had to. There was one truth left unspoken, and it was waiting for her. If you're drawn to shadows that read themselves, and mysteries that don't wait for morning, subscribe, not for me, for her. The next chapter will come, whether you watch or not, but she'd rather not face it alone. Chapter 2. A Village That Won't Speak. Morning in Darnley Green arrived not with the gold-tinged certainty of sunrise, but with a hush so complete that it seemed the very air had forgotten to exhale. Mist clung to the hedgerows like old lace, too heavy for the wind to lift, and the clouds above hung low and indecisive, neither willing to break nor to bless. The cottages, crooked and close together as if whispering secrets to each other, bore signs of life. Smoke curling gently from chimneys, a bicycle leaned against a gate, but the kind of life one feels rather than sees, as though the village itself had retreated just one layer beneath the surface of the visible world. Miss Marple stepped lightly along the cobbled path that sloped gently downward into the heart of the village, her boots tapping a polite rhythm against the stones, her eyes ever so slightly narrowed in thought, not suspicion, not yet, but that careful awareness of pattern and pulse that she had cultivated over decades and that rarely failed her. She carried no umbrella, for the rain had stopped precisely when it was meant to, and the ground was wet enough to remind but not to hinder. Her gloved hands were clasped before her, and her lips did not move, though her mind had already begun its sorting, as if shelving the past evening's events among all the other unsolved questions she had carried across the years. Some answered, some forgotten, and some that had never asked to be remembered at all. Belladonna Books, she noticed with no small measure of disquiet, was no longer there. Not absent in the dramatic sense, no wreckage, no caution tape, no sign of sudden demolition, simply not there. In its place stood a narrow alley flanked by ivy and uneven brick, leading to a brick wall that bore no door, no signage, nothing at all to suggest a shop had ever nestled at its mouth. Yet the candle's glow from the night before remained etched behind her eyelids, and the record player's voice echoed still in the corners of her thoughts. She did not question its disappearance. Not yet. There were other threads to pull, and the village itself, so tight-lipped, so carefully composed, had begun to tug at her attention. She passed the greengrocer's, its window display a little too orderly, as though arranged for inspection rather than purchase. The shopkeeper, a man of middle years with a face built for laughter but now stiff with polite reserve, stepped outside to sweep the already cleaner step, and upon seeing her, offered a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Miss Marple nodded. "Good morning," she said. The man returned her greeting, but his eyes drifted past her, toward the alley where the shop should have been. And then, with the smallest flicker of a twitch at the corner of his mouth, he turned and re-entered his shop without another word. This was the first pattern, politeness in place of honesty. At the post office she requested stamps she did not need, and while the clerk fetched them, Miss Marple asked, quite gently, whether the bookshop had ever reopened. The clerk, young, fresh-faced, with a nervous energy more befitting a choir boy than a keeper of correspondence, froze, the drawer in his hand suspended in air. "Which shop, miss?" he asked, far too quickly. "Belladonna Books," she replied, pretending not to notice the way his fingers trembled slightly against the register. "Just at the edge of the green." "Oh," he said, as if hearing the name for the first time, though the syllables clung to his mouth like dust. "I wouldn't know. Never much paid attention to that end of town." He gave her the stamps and the change, and then busied himself with a ledger that did not need his attention. She did not push him, not yet. Across the square, the school children were being led in from playtime. Their coats flapped like sails in the breeze, and their laughter, while real, seemed oddly muted, like the sound of a gramophone played beneath a thick woolen blanket. One child lagged behind the others, a girl with ash-blonde hair and mismatched socks, pausing to kneel at the foot of the war memorial, where a cluster of pigeons scattered at her approach. From her satchel she pulled a folded sheet of paper, and in that careless way only children possess, let it fall to the wind. It landed at Miss Marple's feet. She bent to retrieve it, and when she unfolded the page, the drawing stared back at her with a quiet, dreadful intensity that only children's art can convey. It was a woman, at least the vague outline of one, trapped behind a pane of glass, her hands splayed outward in silent protest, her mouth a hollow O of perpetual scream. But it was the eyes that drew Miss Marple's attention. They were not eyes at all, but torn pages, tiny lines scrawled within each orb, as though the woman were reading her own story, even as she wept. And in the corner of the drawing, in the careful block letters of early handwriting, the child had written a name. "Eleanor!" Miss Marple looked up. The child was gone, already lost among the others, and the paper in her hand felt heavier than it should have, as though it had absorbed the weight of 100 untold memories. She folded it once, twice, and slipped it into her pocket. From the vicar's gate, Reverend Hallam observed her quietly. He did not call out. He simply watched. She approached him not with suspicion, but with gentle curiosity, as one might approach a man who had long held secrets, but had forgotten which belonged to him and which to the village. "Reverend," she said, "do you remember the Rose Sisters?" He smiled, but it was the smile of a man remembering a hymn without its melody. "Oh, yes. Madeline and Eleanor, quite the pair once. Ran the lending library briefly before the war. They were twins. she asked, though she knew the answer. Identical, he replied. At least, that's what they said. I never could tell. He chuckled, then paused, and the air changed. His gaze drifted to the alley, and for a moment his voice dropped. There was a fire, or a disappearance, or both. People stopped asking. And Eleanor, no grave, no farewell. She just wasn't anymore. And then, as if startled by his own words, he added, It's not good to linger on these things, Miss Marple. Memories are like ink in the rain, smudged when held too tightly. Miss Marple thanked him and turned away, but her thoughts did not. They had begun to arrange themselves around a strange axis, an event half-remembered by a village that remembered everything else far too well. A vanishing so complete that the silence it left behind had become an institution in itself. She returned once more to the alley, and now, under the flat grey sky, Belladonna Books was there. No fanfare, no sound, just a presence reinserted between brick and ivy, as though it had never been absent at all. The candle burned lower than before, its wax pooled upon the sill like the shape of a question. Miss Marple did not enter. Not yet. She stood very still, watching the flickering window, waiting for the reflection to shift, the shelves to creak, the record to play. But the shop was quiet, waiting. Like the rest of the village, nothing seemed out of place, until it suddenly was. A shape moved past the back of the shop's interior, too quick to be detailed, too precise to be accident. A shadow that moved without light to cast it. And then, the sound of a book being closed, firmly, just once. Miss Marple turned and walked away. Not in retreat, but in pause. She would return. She always returned, because there was one truth left unspoken, and it was waiting for her. And Darnley Green, with its fog-choked lanes and paper-thin smiles, with its children who drew what they could not understand and its villagers who remembered nothing exactly but everything completely, had just begun to whisper again. But the silence wasn't empty. It was watching. Chapter 3. The Shop That Shouldn't Be. There are places in this world that do not remain in one place, not entirely. Buildings that shift in the corners of one's vision, thresholds that appear only when the past is ready to be remembered. Belladonna Books, on this morning more silent than most, did not wait for permission. It stood where it had not stood just hours before, fixed in place as though it had never left, the cracks in its window mended, the gold letters above its door restored to a shine too precise to be honest. And yet Miss Marple did not hesitate. She stepped forward, as the clouds broke apart just slightly overhead, not to reveal the sun, but to give it breath enough to watch. The air felt no colder, but something beneath her feet had changed. Perhaps the slope of the earth. Perhaps the grain of time itself. Her gloved hand reached for the doorknob, and it was warm. The bell above the door should have rung. It did not. Instead, a hush rolled inward with her, as if the shop had drawn a single breath in expectation. Her boots met the floorboards with a softness they should not have had. And the scent? Books, certainly, but not old ones, not forgotten tales nor crumbling spines. These books smelled recent, handled, freshly inked, the kind of scent that lingers on a library card not yet returned. The door closed behind her. She had not touched it. Inside, the shop defied time. Nothing was dusty, no cobwebs clung to the beams. The light filtered through the narrow windows in columns so precise they felt painted, unmoved by breeze or motion. The bookshelves, tall, uneven, each crowned with carved wood motifs, stretched higher than they ought to in a shop of this size. They leaned subtly, just enough to suggest motion without movement. As she took her first steps between them, Miss Marple found herself listening, not for footsteps, but for pages turning themselves. In the centre of the room stood the counter. Upon it, a single book, open, resting as if it had been waiting for her return. She knew, without needing to see it, that it was the same one. She stepped closer. The page was dated, tomorrow. The ink had not dried, and in the upper margin once again was her name, Jane Marple, written not in her hand, but in that same charcoal ink that defied age. This time, the sentence repeated was slightly altered, She turned the page, and the story forgot her name. She turned the page, and the words remembered her wrong. She turned the page and became the ending. She turned the page and was written instead. The candle on the windowsill sputtered once and dimmed. The light in the room adjusted, not by shadow or flame, but by agreement between the walls and the moment. The floor creaked behind her. She did not turn around. Instead, she placed a hand on the book's cover and closed it. As she did, the air seemed to shift, not outward, but inward, folding tightly around her, drawing the shop's breath into itself. The temperature did not change, and yet a fine mist gathered at the edge of her vision. She blinked, and when she opened her eyes, the room was not as she had left it. The shelves were now closer, as if they had leaned in to read her more closely. The window appeared farther away, though she had not moved. A ladder, which had rested flat along one bookcase before, now hung vertically in mid-climb, and on the far wall, beneath the faded portrait of a woman whose gaze followed nothing, yet missed nothing, stood a record player. It began to move. The arm lifted of its own volition, the needle descended, a crackle, brief, then a melody. A waltz again, but slower than before, as though dragged backward through time. And then the voice. It was the same voice as the night before, female, calm. Neither familiar nor foreign. Finish what you started, or we'll write someone else. Miss Marple tilted her head. The voice had come not from the speaker, but from the air behind it. She stepped toward it, but the space did not yield. Every footstep felt heard. Every shelf seemed to twitch in the corner of her gaze. She reached the counter once more and saw, just beneath where her hand had rested, a faint mark. Not ink, not pencil, something indented into the wood itself. She leaned in. It was a signature. Eleanor Rose. She stood still. The name rang like a bell behind her ribs. It was not a shock. It was an agreement. Eleanor had never left. Of course she hadn't. The village knew it, though it refused to say. The child had drawn it, the vicar had hinted, and here, etched into the very altar of the shop's confession, was her name. Miss Marple turned again toward the back of the shop. A mirror now stood where the fireplace had once been. Tall, antique, its glass slightly warped. Not by age, but by something else. She approached slowly. Her reflection met her halfway. At first, it was as it should be. Her face, her hat, her calm. And then, just beneath her eyes, movement. Not hers. The reflection blinked a moment too late. The mouth quirked in a smile she had not offered, and the candle behind her in the mirror dripped wax upward. She did not look away. The image shifted again, just slightly. Her reflection reached forward, but she had not moved. It pressed its hand to the glass, palm open. She stood still. And then, from behind the mirror, a sound. A rustle like parchment being folded. A breath, warm against the glass from nowhere. A voice, again the same, softer now. There's still time, Jane, but not for long. She stepped back. The mirror did not. The reflection lingered a moment longer than it should have, then matched her again. Behind her, the book reopened itself. The pages fluttered slowly, rhythmically, as though guided by invisible fingers, until once more it settled on a blank sheet and began to write. Line by line, in that same charcoal script. She thought she was writing the story, but she was always the ink. Miss Marple did not fear this place, but she knew now that it had never been a place at all. Belladonna Books was not brick and beam. It was memory and omission, a location constructed of unspoken truths, populated by characters who did not yet know they had roles to play. The shop did not need readers. It needed endings. She turned toward the door. It was open again. The candle flared once behind her, then steadied. Outside, the village had changed. Slightly. A bench that had faced the green now faced the street. A cat she had seen earlier walked backward across the square, and from the roof of the greengrocer's a single page fluttered downward, caught in no wind. She caught it. It bore a map, hand-drawn, incomplete. At its center, a circle. Beneath it, a phrase. Belladonna is wherever you read it. She folded it, slipped it inside her coat, and as she stepped away from the shop, it vanished behind her, not into fog, not into illusion, but into memory, as if it had never been there to begin with. There was one truth left unspoken, and it was waiting for her. And as she walked, Miss Marple did not look back. Chapter 4. Pages that bleed. There is a silence in every village that does not belong to it. A hush inherited from something long past, folded carefully into each hedge, each stone, each name whispered but never recorded. In Darnley Green, that silence had a weight, a texture. It clung not to the absence of sound, but to the presence of something not spoken, as though the very landscape conspired to hold its breath when asked to remember. And on this morning, quiet but not still, Miss Marple returned to the place that no longer waited to be found. Belladonna Books had once again receded. No doorway, no flame, no facade, but its presence had not withdrawn. It had simply shifted. The drawing in her coat pocket crinkled with each step, the map's ink now smeared into suggestion rather than instruction. She did not need it. The way was clear. Through a garden gate no one tended, past the hollow where the council hall once stood, and down a path where no footprints held. Even in mud, she found the cottage. It had not been there before, and yet it had always been here. Modest in size, its thatched roof bowed with time, the windows veiled in frost despite the season. Ivy curled not upward but downward, as if drawn by something beneath the earth. A single rosebush bloomed beside the steps, white, untouched by the cold, petals open in defiance of winter. It was wrong in the way that only the familiar can be wrong, like a name mispronounced by someone you trust. The door opened at her touch. No lock, no latch, just welcome. Inside, the air was not musty nor fresh. It was occupied, lived in, but by whom it did not say. A chair stood by the fire, unrocking. A teacup on the table bore a faint ring of residue. The kettle had not steamed for years or minutes. The clocks all ticked, out of sync, but not broken. And on the far wall, shelves. Not of books, of journals, dozens, lined in perfect rows. Some bound in leather, some in fabric, some stitched by hand with thread too thin to last this long, but they had. She moved closer, her fingers hovering just above the spines, each marked only by a date. They began in 1945 and ended tomorrow. She selected one from the center, green cloth binding, no title. She opened it. The handwriting was neat, precise, obsessive. The ink did not fade. The voice, though silent, was unmistakably feminine, ordered, educated, but etched with something beneath reason, a quiet unraveling. The entry was dated the summer Eleanor Rose vanished. Today I saw her again. Not Madeline, me. I saw myself walking past the window, but I was inside. It isn't madness. It's the story correcting its shape. They say I was never here, but I was, I am. They think Madeline drowned. They were wrong. It was me. Miss Marple paused, her breath shallow. She turned the page. They wanted endings, happy ones, resolutions. But some lives don't end. They are bound. If the story never finishes, neither do we. I learned the method. The ink must take something. A drop is enough. It writes, it remembers, it holds the shape. Another page. The shop is the key. Not a place. A lock. Each time someone reads, they open it. Each time they leave, something stays behind. And then, another turn, and her finger caught the edge of the page. A slice. Clean, sharp, like paper folded with intent. The blood welled, bright against the aged page. One drop, then another. It fell not with splatter but with precision. The ink accepted it. Before her eyes, the paragraph reshaped. The words flowed from her blood, curled into lines like vines, as if summoned. She read. She bled like all the rest. The air went still. The fire flickered once. The teacup trembled on its saucer, ever so slightly. Miss Marple closed the journal. Not in fear, in recognition. Because this was not madness. It was process. A method perfected by someone who had never stopped writing, even when forgotten. Eleanor had not vanished. She had edited herself out, or had been edited, and this place, this cottage, this archive, was her margin, her footnote. A library built not of books, but of lives, misremembered. Miss Marple returned the journal to the shelf. But the shelf was not as it had been. The volumes now breathed slightly, their spines flexing inward and outward, not visibly but perceptibly, as though the journals longed to be opened again. Each contained a story, not fiction, history, corrected, adjusted, and each had space, too much space, for more. She turned. The mirror above the hearth had no reflection, only page. She stepped closer. The glass surface did not show her. It showed handwriting, flowing across as though from an invisible quill. She read as it wrote. She is close, but not yet bound. She still thinks she is the reader, and then it stopped, as if watching. She reached for her notebook, her hand steady despite the cut. Her pen met paper, but the ink ran dry. No matter. She drew the child's picture from her coat and unfolded it. The lines had changed. The woman behind the glass no longer screamed. She smiled, and her eyes were no longer pages, they were mirrors. There was a knock at the door, 3 times. No one stood outside, only the rosebush, now red, and a page pinned to its stem. There is 1 chapter left, it is not yet written. Miss Marple closed her coat. She walked into the fog. The silence wasn't empty, it was watching. Chapter 5. The Widow and the Wrong Reflection. There are doors in every village that no one knocks on, not out of fear, but because somewhere, buried in the marrow of memory, is the understanding that silence is safer when unshared. At the edge of Darnley Green, beyond the hedgerow that curled like a question never answered, stood one such house, tall and narrow, timber-framed with glass that reflected neither light nor sky, only suggestion. Its gate creaked, not in protest, but in permission, as Miss Marple approached, without urgency, but with purpose. The rosebush she had passed earlier, now fully crimson, watched her from the roadside, though no breeze stirred its leaves. The path to the door was lined with stones, worn smooth by steps too old to remember, and yet none looked disturbed. A single bell pull hung beside the door, braided in silk that had long faded to ash-grey. She pulled it once, gently, and the chime that followed was not musical, but hollow, like wind through the pages of an empty book. The door opened before she could knock twice. The woman who answered did not appear frail, though she was ancient in the way trees are ancient. Not aged, but settled, deeply so, as if the years had folded into her rather than against her. Her hair was long, white, unbound. Her dress, a shade of mourning that had passed out of fashion even before the last war. Her eyes, clouded slightly, but not with blindness, regarded Miss Marple as one might a letter long lost in the post. "I've been expecting you," she said, not with surprise but confirmation. Miss Marple inclined her head. "Then we may speak plainly." The widow stepped aside, and Miss Marple entered. The home was not what she expected. No dust, no neglect. It was orderly, reverent in its presentation, too perfect, too preserved, as if no object had moved unless remembered moving. Every book on the shelf faced outward, titles obscured. The fire was unlit, yet the room held warmth. And everywhere, mirrors. Small, large, oval, cracked, gilt-edged, bare. Leaning in corners, hanging above mantels, resting on tables, none covered, none clean. The widow gestured toward a chair that seemed to have been waiting. Miss Marple sat. "She visits me," the widow said, pouring tea with hands that did not shake. "Eleanor." Miss Marple accepted her cup, untouched. "How long?" since the forgetting. Not before, not when she was real. The widow stirred her tea, once, counterclockwise. Only after the village lost its place in the story. That's when she came back. Miss Marple did not interrupt. She let the space between words stretch just long enough to collect shape. The widow continued. You see, when a story ends, it ends, even a tragic one. But when it's paused, interrupted, it lingers, fills the air like perfume in a room with no windows. Eleanor, she lingered. She rose, crossed the room and stopped before the tallest mirror, a full-length pane whose edges were chipped, its surface softly fogged despite no warmth on the glass. She placed one palm against it. She visits here. Each time someone begins to remember but stops. Each time the story forgets how to end. Miss Marple's voice was low. You believe she still exists? Oh no, said the widow. I don't believe. I remember. And memories, especially the ones no one else agrees with, are the most dangerous sort. She stepped aside. Miss Marple rose and approached the mirror. Her own reflection met her gaze, steady, calm. Her hat sat at the proper tilt, her scarf tucked neatly. But her breath caught, not in fear, but in calculation. Something was off. Not broken, not dramatic, just out of time. Her reflection blinked, a beat too late. Again, and again. She raised her left hand. The reflection followed, but not immediately. It hesitated, then mirrored her perfectly. Too perfectly. She leaned closer. Behind her in the mirror, the widow did not appear. Miss Marple turned her head. The widow stood where she had been, still, watching, but not in the mirror. Miss Marple looked again. In the mirror she stood alone. And then, just as the fire flared from unlit to glowing in a single breath, the reflection smiled. Not widely, not wickedly, just differently. The sort of smile one gives when a truth has finally arrived and it is not to be shared. Miss Marple stepped back. The mirror remained unchanged. You've seen it now, said the widow, her voice no louder than before, but heavier. You've entered the page. Miss Marple met her gaze. Who are you? She asked. The widow's mouth curved ever so slightly. Someone who was edited, she said. Madeline was my sister. I was never born, and yet I remember everything. Silence filled the space, like water rising slowly. Miss Marple turned back to the mirror. This time her reflection did not move, it stared, and in its hand, unmoved, was a page, blank, then writing, line by line. She thought herself the detective, but the story had no need for solving, only telling. The mirror went black. Not dark, black, like ink. Miss Marple blinked. Her own eyes returned. The widow said nothing. And outside, the rosebush dropped a single petal. There was one truth left unspoken, and it was waiting for her. And for the first time, Miss Marple wondered, was she meant to find it? Or had she already been written in? Chapter 6, The Man in the Black Hat. Each evening, precisely as the sun vanished behind the trees that lined Darnley Green's southern field, trees that always appeared older than the map suggested, as if they had grown from forgotten names rather than seeds, the sound of an organ would drift through the air, not loudly, not insistently, but with the gentle insistence of something that had always been there. It was not a church organ, nor the playful wheeze of a fairground relic. It was something in between, low, hollow, almost reverent. A melody that wove itself through the air like thread through a tapestry, only half woven. The villagers never gathered to listen, yet none remained unaware of it. They did not speak of it, not directly, but on evenings when the notes began to rise, curtains were drawn faster, fire stoked earlier, and supper plates went untouched, a little longer. It was on such an evening, with a light mist curling at the edges of the square, that Miss Marple heard the music again, not for the first time, but now with ears sharpened by context. It no longer drifted. It beckoned. She followed it. It led her not to the churchyard, nor the town hall steps, but to the small crescent before Belladonna Books. The shop, once again visible, though the sign above its door now bore only the first word, the rest faded as if erased mid-sentence. The windows were dark, but the music played still, and beneath the window, seated on a worn wooden bench carved with unfamiliar symbols, sat a man. He wore black, not the harsh black of mourning, nor the sleek black of fashion, but the faded, weather-softened black of fabric that had not changed in many years. His coat was long, his boots polished, and atop his head sat a hat, not tall, not wide-brimmed, but shaped just so, the way ink sits atop the page before it spreads. His face was not visible at first. He leaned forward, fingers dancing slowly across the keys of an organ that rested on a wheeled cart, ancient in design, its bellows sighing with every note. No candle lit his music, no sheet guided his hand, and yet the song knew itself. Miss Marple stood silently. He spoke first. 13 notes, he said without looking up, one for each that remained, one for the one that returned. His voice was not young, but it was not old. It belonged to someone untroubled by time. Miss Marple approached slowly. "And who do you play for?" "For the ones who forget," he replied. "And the ones who must not." She sat beside him without invitation, because she understood it was not needed. "You knew Eleanor Rose," she said. The man's fingers paused on the keys. But only for a breath. "I knew her name," he said. "But names are impermanent, like footnotes. They vanish when the story is edited." She looked at him more closely now. His face was shadowed by the brim of his hat, but his jaw was sharp, the skin drawn tight, and his mouth moved not with the effort of speech, but with the rhythm of dictation. Every word seemed transcribed from somewhere else, not memory, not thought, something between. "She wasn't erased," Miss Marple said. "She was rewritten." At that, the man's fingers lifted from the keys. He turned to her, and for the first time she saw his eyes, grey, not clouded, but thin, as if the irises were pages turned too many times. And then he smiled, not in warmth nor in menace, but in recognition. "Not everyone reads themselves," he said, "but you have." He reached into the pocket of his coat and withdrew a page, folded once, crisp, fresh. He handed it to her. Miss Marple unfolded it with care, her own handwriting, her own notebook, the ink the same, the margin marks identical. But she had not written this. She read, "Tonight I spoke to the man who never entered the story, but remembered every ending. He handed me the proof, not to persuade me, but to warn. Because I had already begun to forget what I was meant to solve." She looked up. The man was playing again. She tried to speak, but the notes were louder now, not in volume, but in presence. They filled the air between them like fog, like ink spilled over a letter not meant to be sent. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from familiarity. She folded the page, placed it in her coat. "You never asked who I am," the man said gently. She did not need to, but still, she asked. "Who are you?" He answered without pausing the music. "I am the page before the first chapter," he said. "The one the reader skips, but it's where the story starts." She stood, he played, and as she stepped away, the village around her shimmered. Not dramatically, not visually, but perceptually. A cat that had sat on a wall was now a crow. A door that had faced west now faced north. A lamppost bore a plaque it had not borne before. She read it. A name erased, a soul replaced. Miss Marple turned back. The man was gone, the organ sat silent, and in her pocket the page was gone too, but her memory of it remained. She touched the notebook she carried. It had grown heavier. Inside, another page. She had not placed it there. It read. She asked the right questions, but the story was not waiting for questions. That night, in her room, she stood before her own mirror. Her reflection was still, but it blinked, out of sync, and then smiled, not widely, just differently. There was one truth left unspoken, and it was waiting for her. If you've followed her this far, then the pages know your name too. Subscribe, not for endings, but for the chapter that comes next. The village does not forget, and neither do the stories written inside it. Chapter 7. The Name That Wasn't There. Some truths are not buried but overwritten, and it is only when one begins to peel back the layers of a life that they discover which parts were never theirs to read. In Darnley Green, records had never been lost to fire or war, nor had they been carelessly archived or misplaced beneath the weight of years. No, here, everything remained exactly where it ought to be, and that was the problem. It began with a school register. Miss Marple stood in the back room of the village primary, its walls lined with faded paintings of harvest festivals and stitched samplers by long-graduated children, none of whom would remember Eleanor Rose unless prompted. The headmistress, a woman sharp in speech but courteous in her compliance, had retrieved the old logbooks with some reluctance, her hands trembling only slightly as she laid them on the table. "Records since the turn of the century," she'd said. "But I warn you, there's nothing unusual." That word again, cautious, too careful. Miss Marple turned each page with the same delicacy one might afford to a testimony not yet given. Names lined the columns, crisp and elegant. Harold Brimley, Madeline Rose, George Tibbet, Iris Clemens, class by class, year by year. But never once, Eleanor. "Are you certain this is complete?" Miss Marple asked, her tone light but her eyes unblinking. The headmistress had offered a well-practiced smile. "Quiet. We've always been thorough. Madeline was the only Rose girl. Bright, quiet, tragic story, really." She had not asked what tragedy. The village was too practiced in its half-answers. Instead, Miss Marple had thanked her and left, tucking the copied pages neatly into her case, even though they said nothing at all. It was the absence that spoke. At the church registry it was the same. Births, deaths, christenings. The Rose family appeared again and again, generations of them. But Madeline was the only daughter of record born in 1927. Eleanor did not exist, not by parchment, not by ink, not legally, not spiritually, not even by accident. And yet, she remembered. Others remembered too. The drawing, the journals, the widow. So who, then, was missing? It was not a question to be answered aloud. At the town archive, tucked beneath the apothecary's old cellar, she found the photographs. Hundreds, in stiff-bound albums lined in linen. Class pictures, festivals, maypole dances, war parades. In one, Madeline stood beside a line of girls her age, hands clasped, eyes distant. No twin, no matching face. And yet, in the next photo, one nearly identical, there were two. Eleanor stood beside Madeline. Same dress, same posture, different expression. Her smile, there and not there, as if pasted after the fact, as if stitched from memory not her own. Miss Marple traced the outline of her face with a gloved finger, and then the ink moved. It did not smear, it wept. From Eleanor's eyes, a slow line of black ink crept downward, a tear that had never been drawn, now forming itself in real time. Madeline's hand, formerly held at her side, now reached across, not touching Eleanor, pointing at Miss Marple. She blinked. The photo returned, still, unmoved. Eleanor stood there, but only if she was not looking directly at her. A name erased, a soul replaced. The words the man in the black hat had spoken drifted back to her, not as riddles now, but as transcriptions. He had not been speaking in metaphor, he had been narrating. She turned the photo over. Blank, no date, no names. She opened her notebook and sketched the image quickly, then paused. In her drawing, Eleanor was gone. Madeline stood alone. The mirror across the room reflected the sketch, and in that reflection, the second girl returned. Not beside Madeline. Behind her, smiling. Not widely, just differently. Miss Marple did not flinch. She gathered the records, the sketches, the photographs, and left. Outside, the weather had not changed, yet the air was heavier. Not humid, but written on. Like paper crumpled and smoothed again, never quite flat. Back at her cottage, she laid everything across the table, arranging it not by date but by memory. Pages that no longer matched. Faces that did not repeat. A timeline with one too many threads, or perhaps one too few. She made tea but did not drink it. She sat before the mirror in her hall and waited. For what, she could not say. She did not wait long. The mirror flickered, not with light, but with memory. Her reflection shifted. Not changed, Miss remembered. Her scarf was now blue, her brooch on the wrong side, and then her reflection turned its head before she did. It stared, just for a moment, then blinked, out of sync, and when she looked into its eyes, she did not see herself. She saw ink. There was one truth left unspoken, and it was waiting for her. Chapter 8. The Burned Ledger. It began not with smoke, nor with alarm, but with the distinct absence of a bell that should have rung. In a village like Darnley Green, where time was not measured in hours but in repetitions, how many times the rooster crowed, how often the baker opened late, how precisely the postman arrived 5 minutes before his knock. Any disruption, no matter how quiet, was not unnoticed. So when the fire bell did not toll, and the villagers awoke to find the council's historical chamber collapsed inward like a folded narrative, they did not gasp or run toward it. They simply stood in their thresholds, teacups suspended mid-air, faces unreadable, as if they had long known this chapter would burn itself out. Miss Marple did not wait for invitation. She had been up already, stirred not by noise but by stillness, a quiet that didn't settle but pressed. She had felt it, the way one feels a book out of order on a familiar shelf. Something was missing that had not yet vanished. She stepped into the street, coat drawn tight, hair pinned precisely, and followed the sound of no sound at all, until she reached what remained of the building that once held the past. There was no smoke, no steam, no scent of char. The stone walls remained upright, though stripped of paint, scorched along their edges like paper singed by the wick of a candle that had refused to blow out. The wooden shutters, blackened and curling, dangled like parentheses no longer needed. But the strangest thing, perhaps, was this. The ivy that had always crept up its north wall, the ivy that had stood for 60 years, was gone, cleanly gone. As if never grown, Miss Marple stood at the threshold. Her feet did not hesitate. Not now. Not after the reflection had nodded. Not after the ledger had written itself. She stepped across the line where ash met stone. Inside, the council chamber was hollowed out, but not collapsed. The fire had moved with grace, not chaos, selective, careful. The long oak desk where the vicar's father had once dictated census records had vanished entirely. The shelves where land deeds and maps had once rested were gone, not just burned but erased, their outlines barely ghosted on the blackened walls. The floor was littered with nothing but soot and suggestion. Except for one thing. Near the centre of the room, unmarked, unburned, lay a rectangle of green leather. She knelt. The air thickened, but did not choke. The metal corner clasps were cold to the touch. She opened the ledger. No preface, no title, just a list. Each page bore a year, spaced evenly, precisely 1 decade apart, beginning in 1875 and extending well into the present. Each line, a name. The handwriting never changed, not in ink flow, not in pressure. As though the entries had been written in a single sitting by a single hand over the span of a century. Names known and unknown. Blackwood, Eliza, arrived. Will remain. Clemens, Thomas, arrived. Will remain. Rose, Maidline, arrived. Will remain. No ages, no locations, no reasons. Each name a finality, until the last page. Marple, Jane, arrived, will remain. There was no date beside her name, but the ink shimmered slightly, fresh. Miss Marple stared at the line. Her own name, written not by her, not for her, but about her. a declaration, not of residence, but of permanence. She turned the page, blank. No space for another decade, no column for departed, no record of endings, only arrivals. She closed the book slowly, stood. And for the first time since entering Darnley Green, she hesitated, not out of fear, but out of knowing. The fire had not been spontaneous, it had been intentional. Not destructive, but editorial. The rest of the council's history, birth logs, maps, family trees, had become unnecessary. Once the ledger existed, there was no need for alternate versions. The narrative had simplified itself, the truth had been chosen. She stepped outside, and the silence was waiting. The villagers had gathered, scattered, unspeaking. Children holding parents' hands a little tighter, dogs not barking. Curtains drawn without purpose. No one approached, but all had noticed. They had not come to see what had burned. They had come to see if she had changed. Miss Marple met no one's eye. She walked slowly back toward her cottage, the ledger beneath her coat, its weight unfamiliar not in mass but in meaning. Each step home was longer than it should have been. The streets had shifted again. The lamppost beside the chapel was now beside the bakery. The road signs no longer pointed inward, but away. The ivy on her garden gate had bloomed, though it had been trimmed only the day before. The roses that had been red were white again. Inside her home, everything was where she left it, and yet the clock ticked more slowly. The teacup from last night was empty, but the saucer was stained with ink. She placed the ledger on the table, and her notebook beside it. The page at the top had changed. A sentence now existed she had not written. She had read her ending, but the story still needed its middle. She sat, not to rest, to listen. The room had begun to murmur, not in voices, not in words, but in rhythm. The fireplace cracked, though unlit. The mirror across the hallway pulsed with light that had no source. Her chair creaked, though she had not moved. On the wall above her writing desk, a photograph of her younger self, standing in the garden of St. Mary Mead, flickered, once, then showed her not alone. Beside her, a woman, her face blurred, but her shadow matched Marple's, and the caption beneath, once blank, now read, Miss Marple and her sister. She had never had a sister. She rose, approached the photograph, touched it lightly, and as her fingertip met the glass, the other woman's face resolved, not into recognition, into her own. A second Miss Marple, smiling. Not widely, just differently. There was one truth left unspoken, and it was waiting for her. Chapter 9. The ink that spoke. It was not the ticking clock that stirred Miss Marple from her seat that evening, nor the call of a voice from the lane, nor even the faint scent of smoke still lingering on her coat from the burned chamber hours before. It was something quieter than all of that, something that rose from within, like a sentence half-formed in the mind that one has never spoken aloud, the sort of inner summons that cannot be ignored because it does not originate from logic or memory or fear, but from a sense of pattern. That instinct she had cultivated over years, not by chance, but by care. A cultivated awareness of when the world no longer made sense in the way it had promised to, and instead began rewriting its own margins without asking permission. She stood, coat still draped over her shoulders, though the fire had warmed the room enough to require none, and she crossed to her front door without lighting a lamp, for she could already see the glow outside. Not from the moon, nor from any street lantern, but from a single window far across the green, flickering faintly behind a pane of warped glass. A window that should not have existed, because the shop it belonged to had not been there that morning, and yet now stood resolutely, as if it had always stood there and always would. Belladonna Books awaited. She did not rush. The path knew her feet by now, and the hedges no longer leaned toward her as they had when she first arrived. Now they leaned back, respectfully, as though acknowledging that she was not merely a visitor, but increasingly a page among pages, a character walking willingly toward her next sentence. The bell above the shop's door did not chime again, but the door opened when she reached it, not with abruptness, but with a softness that felt rehearsed. Inside, the air had shifted. It was not fresher, not stale, it was anticipatory. Shelves that once lined the room in slanted rows now stood in precise alignment, like theatre wings waiting for an entrance queue. The books no longer faced inward, they faced her. Open. Pages fluttering without wind. Some had underlined sentences she had not yet read. One bore her initials in a margin she had never marked. Another was blank but warm to the touch. She did not speak. She crossed to the fireplace. It no longer burned. The grate was cold, and yet the scent of char lingered. Not of wood, but of ink that had caught flame and tried, briefly, to remember its own author. And there, beneath the mantel carved with roses whose petals had become letters in the fading of her gaze, she saw it. A panel, slightly ajar, revealing a compartment behind the soot-stained bricks. She knelt. It opened not with resistance, but with relief. Inside, only one object. A bottle, glass, round, unmarked. Filled not with ink, not exactly, but something that resembled it in colour and weight, and yet moved with a life entirely its own. The liquid swirled, though the bottle was still. It pulsed faintly, as if listening, as if remembering. She reached forward, touched the rim. The bottle did not open, but the ink moved. And then, without a pen, without a quill, without contact at all, the soot beside the hearth began to shift. A line appeared. Clear, curved, deliberate. And then another. And another. Until the words lay before her, written in no handwriting she knew, but in a style that suggested inevitability rather than composition. Only the original may leave, all else is revision. She stared, and for the first time, truly, she felt the floor beneath her not as solid, but as suggestion. Revision, not deletion. The village had not forgotten Eleanor, it had been edited. And now she too had been written in. She stood, bottle still within the alcove, untouched, undisturbed. And behind her, the door to the shop slammed shut. Not with violence, with punctuation. She did not flinch. The shelves began to turn. Slowly, not on hinges, on memory. She turned with them. The room was no longer fixed in place. The walls expanded, or perhaps the perspective narrowed, but the space shifted, revealing corners she had not seen, or had seen and forgotten, or had never been permitted to know. In the far corner, another mirror, framed in brass, fogged with something not dust. She stepped toward it. Her reflection waited, not mirrored, anticipating. She raised her hand. It did not follow. Instead, it began to write. On the glass, from the fingertip of her double. Words traced slowly. She asked the right question, but forgot to ask who wrote her asking it. Miss Marple did not move. The reflection smiled and faded. Not into nothing, into ink. The mirror went black. Not dark, black. Like memory sealed beneath wax. She turned back. The shelves now bore only one book. Open. Her name on every page. But the entries changed when she blinked. She saw herself arriving. She saw herself staying. She saw herself deciding to come. She saw herself being written, deciding to come. She saw herself not as she was, but as she had been described, and the description did not match. A knock echoed from inside the fireplace. She turned, but there was no one. Only the ink, still swirling, still waiting, still aware. She opened her notebook, blank, every page. She touched the paper. It wept ink, and on the first line the words appeared. There was one truth left unspoken, and it was waiting for her. She did not turn the page. She closed the book and smiled. Not widely, just differently. Chapter 10. A Life Rewritten. There are moments in a mystery. Not the kind of mystery told in parlours over port or whispered beside hedgerows, but in the kind that breathes, that waits, that rewrites the air around the listener, when the detective begins to believe she has arrived at truth, when the pieces appear to fit not because they are correct, but because they are convincing, when the mind, in its hunger for resolution, takes the story's hand and follows it willingly into a cul-de-sac disguised as a corridor. And this is precisely the moment when Miss Marple, having stared into a mirror that no longer reflected, touched a book that rewrote itself when closed, and stood within walls that shifted when unobserved, told herself that Eleanor Rose, missing twin, ink-bound girl, lost name behind the glass, must be released, must be freed from the shop, the ledger, the ink, the idea, because all signs pointed to her imprisonment, and Jane Marple had solved too many cases to believe otherwise. She believed it quietly but firmly, and with the moral clarity of a woman who had seen justice done before, seen it brought to bear with method and kindness, with tea and truth. And yet here, within Belladonna Books, with each passing moment, that belief began not to fade but to distort, like handwriting that appears familiar until the eye slows and realizes the loops are wrong, the slant unnatural, the rhythm almost right but not entirely so, and soon, like a memory retold too many times, the truth she clung to began to revise itself in whispers beneath the surface. She stood in the centre of the bookshop, surrounded by books that no longer closed, that breathed open as if in sleep, and in her hand she held the notebook that had been hers only in the most superficial sense, its binding familiar, its scent inked with comfort, and yet now every page bore sentences she had not written, recollections of days she had not lived, thoughts that used her voice but spoke of places she had never been, and among these pages, most chilling of all, was the memory of arriving in Darnley Green not by train, nor coach, nor letter of invitation, but by being written into it. A paragraph that opened, "Miss Marple stepped into the village just as the 13th chime rang, her eyes not yet adjusted to the ink beneath her feet." She blinked. The ink beneath her feet? She looked down. The floorboards, worn and lacquered, no longer held grain lines of oak or pine. They pulsed with veins of script, lines of cursive and serif twisting through the knots, not moving, but alive nonetheless, like prose frozen mid-motion, as if the shop had become a page and she merely a sentence, still deciding how to end. She turned. The mirror had returned. Not behind her, but beside her, standing where no wall had existed moments before. Her reflection was gone. In its place, Eleanor, not weeping, not pleading, smiling, not widely, just differently. And then Eleanor moved, not through the mirror, not within it, but behind it. A silhouette of herself tracing the border of the glass, as though looking for a seam, a passage, a portal. Not out, but in. And as she pressed her hand to the pane, the silvering behind the glass shimmered, and from its centre began to bleed black. Miss Marple watched. The ink coiled outward in elegant loops, forming not words but names. First names she recognised, then names she did not. Eliza Blackwood, Thomas Clemens, Madeline Rose, Jane Marple, her own name last, and beside it, Eleanor's signature. Not a notation, an authorship. And the truth, like a story she had once read but had forgotten halfway through, began to unfold. Not in drama, not in horror, but in the quiet unravelling of context. The way a picture changes when a single frame is removed, revealing that the subject was never where you thought it was standing, that the figure in the background had been watching all along. Eleanor was not imprisoned. She was writing. Not just tales, people, places, revisions. And the shop was her desk, her page, her press. The book that opened itself was her pen, and Miss Marple had become a character. She staggered, not with fear, but with dissonance. Memories, hers, began to flicker like candlelight before a gust. She recalled her arrival in Darnley Green, but the train she remembered now pulled into a station with no sign. The letter she had received bore no postmark. The tea she had poured her first night smelled not of bergamot but of ink. And the child who had dropped the drawing, had she spoken? Had anyone? She reached for her notebook. The first page was gone. The second bore only one line. To rewrite her, she must first believe she wrote herself. She flipped again, blank, again, blank, until the final page, it was not blank. It bore a dedication. For Eleanor. By Eleanor. She looked up. The shelves were empty. Every book gone except one. It rested on the counter, open to the middle. She approached. Her hands trembled. Just slightly. The chapter title read, A Life Rewritten, and below it, Miss Marple believed she was solving the mystery, but it had already solved her. She did not close the book. She turned the page and saw herself. Drawn, sketched, detailed with lines of ink that danced beneath her image. She touched the edge. The sketch blinked. Out of sync. Behind her, the mirror darkened. Her reflection returned, but younger, fresher, the Marple of 20 years ago, and she smiled. Not kindly, not cruelly, just knowingly. And the door behind her, the one that had slammed shut, no longer existed. There was no exit, because stories once written do not open their covers again for the same reader, not until the next revision. There was one truth left unspoken, and it was waiting for her. Chapter 11. Who wrote about the writer? There are moments when the walls of reality do not crack, nor splinter, nor fall, but simply tilt, almost imperceptibly, just enough to disorient, just enough to shift the angle at which the world meets the mind, and in that space between knowing and unknowing, a truth slips through, not with urgency, but with patience, as though it had always been there and merely waited to be noticed. And on this evening, with the lights in the bookshop extinguished by no hand, with the mirror dark once again, and the shelves still bare save for that one open volume bearing her likeness in ink, Miss Marple felt that tilt, subtle but unrelenting, as she descended into the part of the story where the narrative no longer unfolded before her, but began curling back upon itself, like a ribbon drawn through unseen fingers. She no longer moved as a guest within the shop, nor even as a detective. She moved as someone summoned by punctuation, a name circled in the margins of a script she had not realized was being edited until it was far too late to determine the original draft. The air in the shop was neither cold nor warm, neither silent nor filled with sound. It was aware, and as she passed between the aisles, her footsteps made no sound, not because she was careful, but because the floor beneath her no longer responded the way floors should. It had begun to listen. There was no mirror now, but she no longer needed one. Instead, a desk had appeared, not newly, but as if it had always existed in the far rear corner of the shop, and had merely been waiting for her to remember it. Its surface unremarkable but for the fact that it was covered in dust. Nowhere else present in the shop. Only here, in this small, forgotten clearing at the heart of Belladonna Books, did time seem to apply. And as she reached forward to brush away the film of years, her hand trembled, not from fear, but from expectation, the way a hand might tremble before opening a letter one knows was never meant for them to read. Beneath the dust, a diary, not bound in leather or cloth, but in paper, thin, almost translucent, with a cover that shimmered faintly as if resisting recognition, and as she opened it, the first page bore no date, no dedication, no introduction. Just one sentence. At this moment, she realized she was not the detective. She was the story. She froze, because she had not yet read it. But she had just thought it. She flipped the page. A paragraph greeted her, not in someone else's hand, but her own, exactly as she would have written it, describing her thoughts in that very moment, line by line, not just the actions, but the internal rhythms, the hesitations, the observations unspoken even in her own mind, until now. She turned another page. Each one recorded a thought, sometimes simple, sometimes abstract, each one perfectly synchronized with her own inner monologue, including things she had never said aloud, including her memory of tea in St. Mary Mead, 5 springs ago when the lemon slice had sunk faster than expected, and she had wondered briefly if the tea had been waiting for that moment just to surprise her. She had told no one, not even herself. She stepped backward. The book closed itself. She did not hear it snap, but she felt it, the same way one feels the closing of a door they had not realized was open. And when she looked up, across the room, she saw herself. Not in a mirror, not reflected, present, standing. Younger, not the age she was now, but the age she had been before her first case, before the war, before the cane and the lines and the silver. Her hair pinned higher, her hat tilted precisely, her cardigan buttoned one higher than necessary, and her eyes, those eyes, brighter, but not innocent, not startled. The younger Marple stared at her, as one might stare at a passage already underlined. Then moved, but did not speak. Instead, her lips formed the same words Miss Marple had just read. At this moment she realized she was not the detective. She was the story, and when she mouthed them, the room pulsed. Not visibly, but with pressure. Miss Marple did not move. She understood now. This was not memory. It was annotation. The younger version did not vanish. She turned, slowly, and began to walk, not toward her, but toward the shelves. And as she walked, her form flickered. Once, then again. Each time she passed between rows, her features shifted slightly, her eyes darker, her jaw set, her gait slower, until she was no longer the younger version, until she was someone else entirely. Eleanor. Smiling. Not widely, just differently. Miss Marple closed her eyes, not to block the image, to remember. Because now something had come unstuck inside her. She remembered not her arrival, but her beginning. Not her train, but her first paragraph. She recalled the way the village had looked, not when she arrived, but when she was described. The hedgerows, the fog, the way the wind whispered a name she had not yet given. And in that memory she saw a desk, not hers, a hand, not hers, writing, deliberately, in long curling sentences. Miss Marple, Jane, arrived, will remain. She opened her eyes. The shelves were gone. The shop was not a shop, it was a page, and she was within it. There was one truth left unspoken, and it was waiting for her. Chapter 12. The Clock That Struck 13. There are places in the mind where time does not tick but curls, where hours do not pass but fold like pages turned out of order. And it was in such a place that Miss Marple now found herself. Not within Belladonna Books, not within Darnley Green as she had known it, but in a version of it, rethreaded by some unseen hand, as if the village itself had become a chapter rewritten mid-sentence, and the space between noon and night had been pressed flat, like a pressed flower, retaining only the shape of something once alive, but no longer obedient to rhythm. The sky was neither bright nor dark. It was the hue of parchment soaked in tea, and the air around her did not move with wind, but with punctuation. A pause here, an ellipsis there, the subtle stop-start of a tale unsure of how it should proceed. She stood on the green, or where the green had once been, though the grass now felt brittle beneath her shoes, and when she lifted one foot, she saw words etched into the soil, not carved but grown, as though the very earth had begun to narrate itself. She did not read them. She did not need to. They were her thoughts, or someone's memory of them, or the idea of her thoughts, transcribed before she could have them. The village clock tower, that crooked relic which had long stood askew but proud, now rose impossibly high, its face gleaming with a brass too polished to be familiar, and as she looked up, it began to chime. Once, then twice, and on until 12, and then a pause, not a silence, a breath held, then 13. The sound did not echo. It lingered, like ink refusing to dry. Her hand instinctively reached for her pocket watch, and though she did not remember placing it there, her fingers found its chain and withdrew it, only to stop mid-motion, for the watch no longer held its shape. Its frame had softened, melted, as if exposed to a heat that had no temperature. Its face no longer bore numbers, but letters, shifting slowly beneath the cracked glass like type, reconfiguring itself. And its hands no longer turned with purpose, but twisted lazily like ribbons in water. She let it fall. It did not hit the ground. It folded into itself and was gone. The world around her had not vanished, but it had loosened. Belladonna Books stood before her, or at least the idea of it did, its facade flickering like old film, now boarded, now burning, now new, now shattered. Its windows changing shape with each blink of her eye, its sign alternating between legible and smudged, its door opening and closing whether approached or ignored. She walked toward it not because she chose to, but because the sentence demanded it, and she had long since ceased to resist what the narrative required. Inside, the shop had become a theatre, not with seats nor stage, but with watchers. Figures lined the walls, still, upright, unmoving. Villagers, or at least their likenesses, the greengrocer, the vicar, the child with the drawing, all present, all flat. Their faces bore no expression, their eyes were ink, their clothes frozen in place as if paper dolls pinned to the air by invisible thumbtacks. Miss Marple reached for one. Her fingers passed through, not with ease, with hesitation. The surface yielded like damp parchment, resisting just enough to suggest it had once been solid. She turned. The shelves had returned, but not with books, with frames. Each held a scene, not photographs, not sketches, moments. Moments she remembered. Moments she had not lived. A dinner she had never attended, a conversation she had never had. A version of her childhood where the door to her home had opened the wrong way. Each scene shimmered until looked at directly. Then, gone. Only when ignored did they persist. At the far end of the shop, the counter, still standing, still holding a book, this one open to a single page, the ink not dry. She read it. She saw herself reading her own ending and understood she had never written it. And beneath that line, a sheet of newspaper, dated tomorrow. The ink smudged only at the corners. She unfolded it. The front page held no image, just a headline. Miss Marple found dead in Darnley Green, investigating a bookshop that does not exist. She stared and felt nothing. Not fear, not denial, only recognition. Because it was not news, it was foreshadowing. It was the sentence that had been waiting since chapter 1. She flipped the page, the obituary, a full column, known for her intelligence, her calm, her method. Miss Jane Marple died under circumstances that remain unexplained. Local villagers deny knowledge of the location where she was found. No shop by the name mentioned in her diary exists in the village registry. Her body was discovered clutching a notebook filled with stories not her own. No one remembers when she arrived. She set the paper down. It did not rest. It dissolved. The mirror behind the counter was gone. In its place, a wall of ink. Moving, watching, breathing, she stepped toward it. Her reflection formed, not as she was, as she had been described. Her smile was there, not wide, just different. And in her hand, a pen. She did not raise it. It raised itself. Her hand moved. She was writing, but she did not know the words. She looked down. The counter bore a parchment, fresh, unmarked. Until now, the ink formed. Chapter 13. The final rewrite. It began not with a step, but with a silence. A particular kind of stillness that does not settle gently over a place, but draws tightly around it, as if the air itself were bracing for punctuation. The moment between the breath and the word, the hesitation before a final name is written, and as Miss Marple stood in the shifting hollow where belladonna books flickered between ruin and restoration, it became clear that there would be no more questions asked and no more clues found. For this was not the moment for solving, not the unravelling of threads, but the stitching of a final seam, a binding, and she, who had followed ink-stained footprints through glass and time, was no longer following the story, but completing it. The organ began again, soft at first, its notes drifting not through air but through memory, a slow, haunting tune that hummed against the bones of the shop as if the walls themselves had been waiting to hear it once more. And with every bar played, the room took shape, not into something new, but something remembered too well. Spines returning to shelves, frames turning back to books, the walls smoothing, the floor hardening, and the mirror, ah yes, the mirror, darkening again, as though it knew this was not a reflection it needed to hold much longer. She stepped forward. There was no need to look for Eleanor now, no purpose in tracing the ink or questioning the ledger, because the book on the counter, always waiting, was open, and its final page, turned as if by breath, bore a title she recognised before she ever read it. Miss Marple and the Bookshop of Shadows. It was not written in a hand she knew, and yet it was hers. Not her script, her authorship. It had been waiting for her since the first chime struck 13. The page beneath the title was empty, but warm to the touch, and as she reached out, not with trembling, not with fear, but with understanding, the ink began to form, line by line, not written by her, not written for her, but written as her, a transcription of the moment unfolding even as she lived it. She solved every case. The organ played on. Outside the windows, if they were windows anymore, the village did not move. The villagers, too stiff to be real, too still to be living, turned slightly in their frames, and for a moment, every eye looked inward, not at her, through her, except her own. She exhaled. She had expected surprise, perhaps sorrow, perhaps a final twist of fear. Instead, relief, because now it all made sense, not as in logic, as in structure. She had never been the author. She had been the final chapter waiting to be drafted, a conclusion long withheld. Her hand lowered. The page was complete. She looked to the mirror. There she stood, but not as she was, as she had been meant to be. Eyes not grey but ink dark, hair pinned not by choice but by character description. A smile, faint, knowing, not wide, just different. And in her reflection's hand, the candle. Its flame flickered once. She blinked. The reflection blinked in time. The candle went out. There was one truth left unspoken, and it was waiting for her. Chapter 14. The book reopens. The village of Darnley Green had no reason to be remembered. It was too far from the coast to invite wanderers, and too far from the rail line to encourage pause, and yet it remained, tucked between hedgerows that had never been measured and trees whose rings told a different calendar than any known to man, a place that existed not for those who knew it, but for those who stumbled upon it at just the right moment in their story, or rather, just the right page. A year had passed, or at least that was how the seasons had chosen to behave. Snow had fallen and melted. Flowers had bloomed and browned. The bells of the chapel had rung for weddings and for silence. And the bookshop, well, that depended on who was looking. For most, the shop was not there. Its window showed only stone, its door showed only brick, its memory lived only in spaces not spoken aloud. But on the first Monday of October, just before dusk, when the sky turned to parchment and the clouds arranged themselves like footnotes across the horizon, a woman arrived by foot, not hurried, not lost, simply arrived, the way sentences sometimes begin without needing to explain where the thought came from. She was young, or perhaps she had once been. Her boots bore the story of distance, and her coat, worn but cared for, carried the scent of old paper. A satchel hung across her chest, heavier than it looked, and in her hand she carried no phone, no guidebook, no invitation. Only a journal, closed, blank. The villagers noticed her. Of course they did. They always noticed. But none approached. They stood as they had stood a year before, quiet, composed, watching from thresholds and windows and behind garden gates, eyes calm but unreadable, their stillness not unnatural, only deliberate, like words left unsaid out of habit, or names unspoken out of respect. The woman saw them. She nodded once. They did not nod back. She turned down the lane. At its end, Belladonna Books, no fog, no illusion, the shop was simply there, as if it had always been. The bell above the door, silent for a year, rang, not loudly, but enough. The woman stepped inside. The air was still. The shelves, exactly as they had been when Miss Marple had last seen them, stood in their crooked rows, tall and leaning, some full, some empty, their titles half legible, their pages all turned toward her. She did not speak, she did not wander. She walked straight to the counter. The book lay open. Not a book. The book. It had been waiting. The candle beside it flickered once. She placed her hand on the page, and the ink began. It did not ask her name. It knew. It wrote. She came not to solve, but to remember. The woman blinked. The candle dimmed. Outside, the villagers turned away, one by one. The chapel bell struck once. The organ began to play. And the story reopened. Every 10 years, the story needs someone new to read it, tag a detective, before it chooses you. There was one truth left unspoken, and it was waiting for her. Chapter 15, The Comet Clue. It is often said that stories end when the final word is written, the final page turned, and the candle gutters to silence. But those who have followed long enough, who have read not just the plot but the pauses, the notations in the margins, the skipped beats between each footstep and each breath, know better. Stories do not end, they close. Like books on shelves that never gather dust, like doors that lock from the inside. And Darnley Green, quiet again, stitched back together with routine and rain, waits. Waits for silence to be mistaken for peace. Waits for the reader to forget what they've seen. Waits for the next one. Outside, the shop appears gone. The windows reflect only clouds. The bricks show no cracks, no candlelight. A "To Let" sign swings faintly in the autumn wind. The villagers move once more with purpose, not hurrying, never rushing, but alive again in that peculiar, painted way that suggests something beneath the surface is watching them closely. They speak, laugh softly, tend to roses that never quite wilt, but none go near the lane, not anymore. Inside the shop, though none would know, it is still open, just not in the way one might expect. The final page remains, not blank, written, but not by Miss Marple, not by Eleanor, not even by the one who held the pen. It is written by observation, by you, because there are things, important things, that were never fully explained, and perhaps they never were meant to be. Perhaps that is the design. Perhaps that's what makes a detective necessary. But now, it is no longer hers. It is yours. The room is quiet. The book lies closed. And yet, even now, the pages stir. The candle flickers. The ink waits. And the voice, soft, familiar, somewhere between the ear and the mind, returns. What did you miss, detective? The clock stopped at 3:17. But no one heard it. Why? The scene holds for a moment, breathless. Then, on screen. Did Miss Marple ever exist at all? Or was she a story written to replace another? Was Eleanor ever real? And just before the page turns, comment your theory below, before the next one arrives. Watch again. There were 7 lies hidden in plain sight. Can you find them? Then, the candle dims once more. Ink begins to coil across a new page. unclaimed, unwritten, waiting. There was one truth left unspoken, and now it's yours.